The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
Order, order. Daniel Sagner to move the motion. Thank you, Mr Hosey. I beg to move that this House has considered e-petition 254607 relating to restoring nature and preventing climate change. And it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Hosey, and also an honour to introduce this petition on behalf of the Petitions Committee. And it's timely because, of course, of the climate crisis we face, but also, I'd say, for those who listen to the Archers, because it's a hot topic in Ambridge at the moment, and that's always a useful barometer for a certain part of public opinion. Now, the petition calls for natural climate solutions, such as rewilding, to be enacted to tackle the climate emergency, signed by around 110,000 people, including over 650 from Cambridge, my constituency. And it actually makes a series of important points, so let me start by reading it into the record. The petition reads, "Restore nature on a massive scale to help stop climate breakdown. To avoid a climate emergency, we need to act fast. Rewilding and other natural climate solutions can draw millions of tonnes of CO2 out of the air through restoring and protecting our living systems. We call on the UK Government to make a bold financial and political commitment to nature's recovery. We need to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade to avoid the catastrophic effects of climate breakdown. To do this, we need both to reduce carbon emissions and to remove carbon from the atmosphere. By drawing down carbon, nature's recovery can help us reach net carbon zero. We have a chance for the UK to become a world leader in natural climate solutions. Those who manage our land and sea play a pivotal role and should be supported to come together to deliver carbon reductions." Now, I doubt that there are many, or even any of us here, who will disagree with much in this statement. And it certainly is a topic which chimes with much of the public mood over the last year. With the school climate strikes, the Extinction Rebellion protests, and many more related campaigns, it's clear that stopping climate breakdown is at the top of the agenda for many, many people. Very happy to.
As usual, can I congratulate him on these wonderful debates he has this magic power of being able to get. But can I tell him that more people in Huddersfield than Ambridge voted and signed this petition? So let's put it out on the record. But also, would you agree with me, we need more action from this government and from the opposition parties? The climate change is now. We mustn't put noughts on. We need the northern forest, but we need millions of trees planted. But we need so much more. Would he agree with me? This is an emergency. We've got to act now.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and strangely enough, I agree. And you will find I'm going to agree as I go through my speech. But perhaps we should start with some definitions. And I'm going to make an introductory caveat, because I'm not one of those who believes that humankind is the cause of all problems, although we cause many. I've always been slightly puzzled by the term unspoilt that some apply to areas untouched by human intervention. There are certainly many, far too many places that have been absolutely spoiled, polluted and harmed. But there are also many examples of glorious and wonderful buildings and interventions where people have achieved works of great beauty. Absolutely.
I'm very grateful for the Honourable Gentleman for giving way, and in that, recognising of where humans can enhance our environment, will he join with me in paying tribute to Sussex Wildlife Trust and indeed the wildlife trusts around the country who do so much to support our environment with innovative and practical solutions?
Grateful to the Honourable Gentleman, and I suspect that many members around the Chamber will have worked with their local wildlife trusts and see the excellent work they do. Indeed, just a few weeks ago I was with the Cambridgeshire Wildlife Trust releasing Nora the hedgehog into the wild. Well, I have to say that Nora's particular building that had been constructed was not one of those great works of art that I was about to reference in my great city of Cambridge, because Cambridge is full of fine examples of magnificent buildings, and we're very proud of them. And they're often, of course, the work of previous generations, sometimes, of course, created in political and economic circumstances which we would not now accept. But I think we can all point to examples across cultures and countries across the world of magnificent inventions. So my point is not that we are for or against nature, but particularly with better scientific understanding of the impact we have on the wider environment, we now have a particular responsibility to act in a way that not only does no more harm, but where previous harm has been caused, we use the opportunity to work with natural processes to secure improvement. And that is my starting point. So let's take them in order. Honourable Lady.
For giving way. Kent Wildlife Trust, along with others, have a strategy of greening urban areas. So will he welcome not just their initiatives, but other initiatives such as that at Luton Junior School in my constituency, to build a green wall, a living wall that will help sort of absorb some of those pollution and make the sort of children that go to those schools improve their health for the future?
Honourable Lady is absolutely correct, and I suspect we will be hearing more examples of the good work that are being done by other wildlife trusts, and I pass to the next intervention.
Say a word about the role of water and wetlands, because he'll know the example of Wicken Fen in Cambridgeshire and the work that's being done to improve the wetlands over towards Anglesey Abbey. But we could do with a lot more like that around the country, and in Hertfordshire our chalk streams are suffering from over-abstraction. Don't we need a policy for water?
The Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right. Strangely enough, I'm about to embark upon a tour of the wetlands, and Wicken Fen will be one of them. But absolutely right, and we have particularly seen, of course, in this summer, and we've seen some particular problems with a number of the streams drying up. So absolutely we need a plan for water.
You give way?
I'll give way to my honourable friend and then the Honourable Lady.
Is my friend aware of the reports by the IPCC in 2018 and the IPBS in 2019 that show that nature and climate crisis are inextricably linked, and that the IPBS reports say that 1 million species globally are at risk of extinction? And does he agree with me that the nature-based solutions are a fundamental way to stop climate change and prevent extinction of species?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and again I will be coming to some of these points in my speech. May I turn to the Honourable Lady?
I'm grateful to him. He's been very generous in giving way, and it's great that we're all paying tribute to our local wildlife trusts, and I'll put in a word as well for the wonderful Sussex Wildlife Trust. But doesn't he agree that what we really need is urgent action? And on that subject, right now, ministers could make a decision to ban the burning of blanket bog. In other words, ending that way of releasing huge amounts of emissions which otherwise could be captured by peat. When we consider that globally peatlands can store more carbon than rainforests, we need to be doing much more and not doing burning on them.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, and strangely enough, further in my speech, that very point will be made, but she's absolutely right, as is the Honourable Gentleman from a sedentary position. Very happy to continue.
Thank you. The Honourable Gentleman from Cambridge is being exceedingly generous with taking interventions in what is a very important debate. And like others here, I also want to pay tribute to the Walthamstow wetlands. I hope that will be on his campaign tour. We're very pleased with it. And also my local authority, which has planted 5,000 trees alone in Waltham Forest in the last year. But my honourable friend from Brighton Pavilion is right when she says that we also need to look at what government can do. And indeed, many of us are interested in the ideas about carbon pricing and how we can further incentivise rewilding as part of tackling climate change. That frankly, it's not enough to leave it to local communities and local authorities who do individually brilliant things. It's also now time, in this time of climate emergency, to ask national government to incentivise rewilding. Does he have a view on that?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I have to say I had a wonderful day out in Walthamstow with my partner earlier this year when we came to see some of the wonderful things that are being done there. But on this point of urgency, it is absolutely right, and the conclusion to my speech will be to lay down a challenge to the Minister, which I'm sure he will respond to, about the degree of urgency that we face. Happy to give way.
Anyway, he's being very generous. Does he agree with me, though, that in any rewilding scheme, it is far more likely to be successful if it is pursued and taken along with the consent of the local community and consent of local landowners?
The gentleman is absolutely right, and again, this is the point I'll be coming to in my speech. But when we work together with local communities, we can achieve so much more. Now, the petition specifically talks about rewilding and natural climate solutions. And over the next few minutes, I'd like to draw on a number of examples and points raised with me by experts on these subjects. The organisation Rewilding Britain described this as being about people reconnecting with nature, wildlife returning and habitats expanding, all the time while communities flourish with new opportunities. And it starts from the principle that natural processes drive outcomes, and that rewilding is to go where nature takes it, with long-term benefits for future generations. So let me turn to some examples, and I will start close to home because there are some wonderful long-term projects, such as the National Trust's visionary project to restore wetlands around Wycombe Fen in Cambridgeshire, as has already been referred to. And it's a project that has been so ably promoted over many years by Tony Juniper, who now chairs Natural England. He's a highly regarded environmentalist. And I would just say in passing, he was also my Green opponent in the general election of 2010 in Cambridge. And we actually spent a long evening at the Count together after he'd run an absolutely brilliant, vigorous and exciting campaign, which sadly for him secured only a few thousand votes. And he was only marginally behind me, who was in a very disappointing third at that time. So I just gently say to colleagues, beware, election outcomes aren't always exactly as anticipated. Tony, of course, has also recently written extensively about the social and economic benefits of a nature-centric Green New Deal, which would unlock benefits such as public health improvements, both physical and mental, and it's a programme which I certainly strongly approve of. But it's not just land policy that attracts the attention of rewilders. We need to look also to our oceans as well. Certainly.
The Honourable Member's just touched upon something that I think is very important in terms of the way that we approach this debate. We often talk about, when we're talking about rewilding and climate change, we talk about the challenges. But actually, would it not be better sometimes if we talk about the opportunities in terms of jobs and the economy, but also of our social fabric as well?
Slightly alarmed, Mr Hosey, at the unanimity that's breaking out in this chamber today, but the honourable gentleman is, of course, absolutely right, and many of us have noticed that in the last period it is actually the green economy that has survived periods of recession much more effectively than the rest of the economy. So he is absolutely right. Returning to the oceans, though, Mr Hosey, securing no fish zones in some of our oceans to allow marine habitats to recover from the effects of bottom trawling and scallop dredging, such as the no-take zone in Lamlash Bay in Scotland, is beautifully outlined by Rewilding Britain on their website. And these issues are not always straightforward, because in my area, the Cambridge Independent reported last week, the Cambridgeshire County Council's goal of reaching net zero carbon emissions is going to be more challenging than originally thought, as peatland emissions will be included in government calculations from next year. And Cambridge University Science and Policy Exchange, who strongly advocate nature-based solutions, identified, as the Honourable Lady rightly pointed out, that peatland is a significant contributor to CO2 emissions in Cambridgeshire, an issue which the RSPB's Adam Barnett tells me is absolutely crucial. Consequently, the RSPB and other organisations rightly want to ban burning of peat bogs, as this releases carbon and is extremely damaging to our atmosphere. And I do hope we will get a response from the Minister on that, because I know questions have been put to ministers before. So these are just some of the complex range of issues to consider. And the staff serving the Petitions Committee were kind enough to set up an engagement event on the topic in Cambridge last week. And we had an extremely well-informed round table with experts in my constituency. I'd like to record my thanks to the clerks of the committee for their work on this. Our discussion took place at the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, which is located in the iconic David Attenborough building in Cambridge, which is a conservation campus home to organisations that promote the natural world, such as the RSPB, Flora and Fauna International, BirdLife International, and many, many others. And there I was privileged to meet Dr. Mike Rands, the Executive Director of the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, and Dr. Andy Clements, the Director of the British Trust for Ornithology. And they both shared their insights on natural restoration with me. Dr. Clements hammered home the point that data and monitoring of natural activity is crucial. We must know the state of affairs to be able to improve it. Now,
before he moves off,
I will.
Would he allow me? He's very kind. He has a great advantage, as I have, of having a superb university in our constituency. Are universities in partnership doing enough in terms of leadership? Because I find many universities are doing research, not sharing with local communities and local groups or even local government. Do you think more could be done? And of course, many universities like Cambridge are very large landowners.
As ever, my honourable friend makes an important point. I think the University of Cambridge provides global leadership, quite frankly, but I do point out to them occasionally that that link with the local community can also be improved, and I think that's a very important point. Universities need to be close to their communities.
just make a comment about Professor Sir David King, of course, former Master of Emmanuel College, Emeritus Professor at Cambridge, who has been the Governor's Chief Scientific Advisor on this, been such a strong advocate for carbon sinks.
Indeed, Sir David is, of course, one of my constituents, and I'm very happily canvassed him recently. Cambridge is a wonderful place to canvass, I can assure you.
He's very flat.
Cambridgeshire is not as flat as all that, I'll tell you, if you cycle around. But in answer to the Honourable Gentleman's point, yes, and some of the leadership, and of course some of the extraordinary plans and ideas that are being brought forward from places like the University of Cambridge in terms of some of the dramatic interventions we may make to tackle climate change are really, really important. But if I could return to the data for a moment, there are many ways in which we can assess what is happening in our world. But I have to say, as I was having that discussion, I was immediately reminded of the work of some of our immensely important organisations, such as the Bumblebee Conservation Trust. Their chief executive, the inspiring Jill Perkins, has made this point to me before, that their annual bee walk involves volunteer bee walkers walking the same fixed route once a month between March and October, counting the bumblebees seen and identifying them to species and caste where possible. That's very, very important. I suspect we're all familiar with the hugely popular and important RSPB annual Big Garden Bird Watch. These are just some of the ways in which we can monitor and assess just what is going on. And as honourable members have suggested, I believe that such public engagement is vital to this process. And by encouraging each other to monitor the world around us, I'm convinced that we are better informed in our efforts to protect it. Now, during our discussion in Cambridge, the importance of data and evidence was further highlighted by Hazel Thornton of the UN Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Unit. And she told me that out of 337 common interventions that they have assessed, only around a third are evidence-based. Now, I thought that was a very striking statistic. And I suspect that all too often we do things which we think to be helpful, frankly, just because they're the things we have always done, without really knowing whether they have the desired outcomes, or worse still, the risk of unintended consequences. Now, she advocated government support for open access data and decision-making tools, which should include consideration of costs and local values. And she also called for government funding for a long-term evidence monitoring system. I have considerable sympathy, because important as the voluntary efforts are, I do think they need to be complementary to rigorous scientific recording. Dr. Clements also highlighted the need to tackle both the carbon crisis and the biodiversity crisis together. And he pointed out that in some ways the carbon crisis is simpler to communicate to the wider public. We can probably all remember the need to limit temperature rises to below 2 degrees. But the biodiversity crisis, just as crucial, is perhaps harder to explain in simple, memorable terms that capture public attention. Now, Mr. Hosey, almost as we speak here, discussions in the main chamber will impact on the ways forward on this. Whether the proposed Environment Bill or indeed our wider future relationship with our European partners, both will have significant impact on these issues. And a point that's been much stressed in the many recent debates is that were we to leave the European Union, it must not lead to the potential regression of existing environmental standards. Dr. Clements emphasises to me, and as you would probably expect, there's near universal agreement amongst those experts in this field. The combined power and influence of 28 states acting together should not be lost. This is a global climate crisis, and we must tackle it collaboratively. Now, Sue Wells from the Cambridge Conservation Forum focused on the need to take oceans into account when making policy. She explained that marine issues could get left behind compared to the terrestrial projects. Another issue highlighted locally was that of fenland projects. Roger Mitchell of Fens for the Future talked about the need for nature-based solutions to the carbon emissions of the fens, as we have already discussed. So all this just suggests a wider picture. When developing our land for our needs, housing, transport, infrastructure, we must maintain a focus on natural capital and on nature-based solutions to carbon emissions. Whether that's when planning flood diversions and defences with natural solutions, or in projects such as East-West Rail, which affects my constituency, and the natural capital work there, we must focus on the environment alongside any development plans. And there are some good examples of where past developments can be improved. Recently, I visited Anglian Water's sewage treatment plant in Ingoldsthorpe, Norfolk, with the all-party parliamentary group for the East of England. And we were all impressed with the work they'd done to create beautiful wetlands and increase local and regional biodiversity. The restored wetland removes the need for carbon-intensive, expensive, nutrient-stripping techniques while improving water quality, a great project led by the Norfolk Rivers Trust. So we must keep our focus on the environment when we're delivering investment for the future, and we must think long-term. Sarah Smith of the Wycombe Fen Rewilding Project told me they have a 100-year plan to extend the nature reserve by the 10 miles that I mentioned earlier.
Honourable friend, give way.
Very happy to.
No, I'm grateful to him for giving way, and it allows me to put my tribute on the record to the Cheshire Wildlife Trust, who run the Eastwood Nature Reserve in Staley Bridge. But of the things he's just mentioned, because I think we'd all certainly agree with him, would you agree with me that housing is perhaps the area that needs to see the biggest change? Because I see far too many generic, developer-led developments that have no relationship to the natural world around them. And if we're serious about this, not just putting investment in, but changing how we do things, I think housing has to be planned in a much better way with the local environment. If we're serious about doing things like garden villages, that could be the way, but I don't think the present approach would meet the outcome he's quite ably describing.
I'm grateful to Honourable Fenn's intervention. I think that takes us off into a different debate in some ways, but I absolutely agree with him. And, of course, it is much to be regretted that the very high environmental standards for new build that were in place in 2010 are no longer in place, but I'm sure they can be restored, if not before Christmas, soon afterwards, perhaps. But I was talking earlier about long-term planning. I have to say that if Wycombe Fen is looking 100 years ahead, I'm not sure Parliament can look forward 100 hours at the moment. But we do need to commit to long-term natural restoration. But certainly.
We just put on the record the importance and value of roadside nature reserves, which are often forgotten in this sort of dynamic environment that we live in. Many of our wildlife trusts will work alongside their local authority to keep our roadside nature reserves wild and important, and having that sort of kind of those species living in that protected environment. But there is no statutory requirement for local authorities to invest in them. So I think it's important that we remember the importance and the value of the roadside nature reserves in the whole issue of this debate.
The Honourable Lady must be a mind reader. She's my very next point. But she makes a very important point, because what I was going to say was that beyond these very long-term big projects, there are some quite simple things that can be done locally. And this was drawn to my attention by Olivia Norfolk of Anglia Ruskin University, who said that simple solutions in urban environments to encourage nature restoration, such as not mowing road verges, can be really important. But she also argued that while we can all act ourselves, we do need urgent systemic changes to the way we run the country. We cannot continue to export our costs overseas. So this issue must be tackled in the round, individually and locally, nationally and internationally. Yes, happy.
I'm grateful. The interchange of my honourable friend reminds me that when I served as Roads Minister in the 1980s, we planted over 1 million trees a year. They weren't actually trees when they were planted. They turned into trees, many of them. And I think that some of those nature reserves are very important, especially if they can provide continuous habitat and corridors for animals to get around, not just the foxes getting to town along the railways, but actually to provide the variety of planting that you don't get often in some managed forests.
Well, very grateful for that intervention. It must be a wonderful thing to be able to see that, the trees that were planted then have now come to fruition, and that is a very important point too. So if we are to consider all of this alongside a Future Generations initiative, it's not only individual and cultural changes that we need to make, but systemic government-led ones too. And Tom Maddox of the Natural Capital Hub and Flora and Fauna International told me of the need to adopt a holistic approach. And in 2021, let me just finish the sentence. In 2021, the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration starts, a huge opportunity. Let's beat the curve and adopt those radical and far-reaching changes. Now I give way to...
I apologise for interrupting him. I thought there was a semicolon, and I think that perhaps there wasn't. But I know he's concerned about an outbreak of unanimity, so in case that should be the case, could I just put it to him that natural climate solutions must be supported, but only in addition to, not instead of, rapid emission reductions in every other part of the economy? And would he share my concern that Heathrow Airport, for example, are pushing a whole set of ideas around peatland restoration as part of its so-called carbon-neutral growth plans, but not actually changing business as usual? So we mustn't use natural climate solutions as a way of avoiding real carbon reduction.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. I'm sure there's no danger of complete unanimity breaking out when she's in the room, and she's absolutely right that when it comes to the issue of Heathrow, there is certainly not likely to be unanimity. And it's a very important point, because I'm afraid sometimes, and I'm not saying this about that particular project, sometimes it's pretty clear that there's some greenwash going on, and we have to always be mindful of that. So in conclusion, Mr Hosey, I would actually like now to turn to the government and ask for a couple of commitments. One is clear leadership and a commitment to implementing nature restoration measures rather than simply leaving it to the market, where too often simplistic short-term economic arguments too often win out. Yes, restoration can make absolute economic sense on a macro level, but for individual actors, they need both encouragement and education and direction as to why they should change their behaviour, and targets and monitoring are absolutely vital there. Secondly, as is often the way, I suspect, I want to press for more ambition from the government. The 25-year environment plan does have measures which would improve our natural environment, yes, but many would say that we should go much, much further. The commitment to restore 500,000 hectares, for example, is half what a single company has pledged in Indonesia. And take a look at what others have pledged in the Bond Challenge. The commitment to raise forest cover in England from 10 to 12% takes us from the 6th lowest in Europe to the 8th lowest, and still behind Scotland and Wales. Most European countries have over a third of their land covered in forest. Belgium has a similar population density to us, but over twice the forest. So we can do more. We can challenge ourselves further. Certainly.
I thank him for giving way, and I'm glad to hear him pay tribute to the Scottish Government and their efforts. But would he agree with me that the efforts of organisations like Network Rail really hold that back? Because they're at the moment trying to cut down swathes of trees along the railway lines and through my constituency, removing a nature corridor, which is really important to local people.
The Honourable Lady is absolutely right and points to exactly the kind of trade-offs that I was referring to. As a member of the Transport Select Committee, I should be at this very moment questioning Mr Williams on this issue, but she's right to draw attention to the many trees that are being destroyed. Let me finally conclude, though, Mr Hosey, with a voice from a future generation, because last week I received a letter from a 10-year-old girl in my constituency from primary school, and I'd just like to quote two of the things she said. She said, "Sir David Attenborough said that nature recovery laws must be created to ensure that habitats are expanded and reconnected. Please ask the government to pass a law to protect our wildlife." She went on, "Secondly, our wildlife is endangered by the plastic in the sea and us cutting down their homes. We also need to stop littering around our environment, fields, and especially on the beach. To sum up, I need you to tell the government that they need to act now. And my question for the government is, do you want to keep ruining animals' lives, or do you want to save the animals and our world from climate change?" I have to say, Mr Hosey, in my political life I've rarely invoked Maggie, but today I hope the Minister will rise to 21st century Maggie's challenge and act to protect her and our future.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 254607 relating to restoring nature and climate change. David Tredynick.
Mr Hosey, thank you very much for calling me first on this side in this debate. And I'd like to declare an interest that I am a member of the Conservative Environmental Network, and I've been a member of the Tory Green Initiative before that in the 80s. And my commitment to the environment is sincere. I have to congratulate the Honourable Gentleman, the member for Cambridge's constituents, on their ingenuity in using a petition, which is a very unusual way of taking their concerns to a committee of the House, formed as it is of general members. And I hope today that they will feel satisfied with the response that they receive. And my honourable friend on the front bench, who himself has done so much in the field of environment long before he was promoted to being a minister. Mr Hosey, I would like to congratulate the government on what it's done so far, particularly on setting carbon limits, dealing with deforestation, and the work on plastics. Last year I was in India, in Bangalore, and I was astonished at the amount of plastics there. This autumn I was in Delhi, and I saw very little plastic, and I asked my host why, and they said, well, we have acted here, and it has made a decisive difference. Mr. Hosey, the issue of carbon emissions goes beyond the countryside, and it has to be faced by other departments other than the Department of Environment. In the Queen's speech, I drew to the Health Secretary's attention that the NHS carbon footprint in England is around 27 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents. And I suggested to him that all new hospitals and health facilities in this country should take into account the carbon footprint. But it is not just this carbon footprint which is high as it concerns health service buildings that should be taken into account. We have to look also at the carbon footprint of healthcare services and medicines. The carbon footprint is measured without taking into consideration the pharmaceutical products provided as medicines. And I refer colleagues to an article published in Agence France Press last year, which said large numbers of pharmaceuticals are found at levels dangerous for wildlife and the environment in our river system around the world, and that they are coursing with over-the-counter and prescription drug waste, which is extremely harmful. If this trend persists, the amount of pharmaceutical effluents leaching into waterways could increase by 2/3 before 2050, according to scientists speaking at the European Geosciences Union Conference in Vienna in April 2018. A large part of the freshwater ecosystems is potentially endangered by this high level of pharmaceuticals, said Francesco Brigoli, who is a researcher at the IHE Delft Institute for Water Education. He said a large number of drugs, analgesics, antibiotics, antiplatelet agents, hormones, psychiatric drugs, antihistamines have been found at levels dangerous for wildlife. And as part of his study, he focused on one drug, diclofenac. I hope I pronounced that correctly, Mr. Hosey. Both the European Union and the US Environmental Protection Agency have identified diclofenac as an environmental threat. I referred to India earlier. Veterinary use of it has driven a subspecies of vultures on the Indian subcontinent to the brink of extinction. I'm going to try and look at the scale of the problem as respects healthcare. Healthcare in the world's largest economies account for 4% of global emissions. CO2 emissions from healthcare in the world's largest economies account for about 5% of their national carbon footprints, according to a recent study. This study also found that China and India make up about 4% of the global total, and scientists at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research in Germany have very firmly linked climate change and medicine. They have said they are inextricably linked. with the rising global temperatures associated with everything from the spread of infectious diseases to the impacts of dangerous weather events. They have said this is a major threat of the 21st century to human health. So I will give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I'm listening attentively to what he's saying. There's a group of us, cross-party group, very interested in the quality of water in our rivers and streams. Indeed, in Huddersfield, I chair Green Streams, which looks at that locally. Would he be involved with us in looking at the quality of the Thames and how it actually turned around the pollution, the high levels of pollution, right on our doorstep? And of course, this Palace of Westminster and its new building will have a vast impact on that river as we build the new palace.
Mr. Hosey, I certainly would, and as representing a hosiery network constituency in the Midlands, Bosworth, I have spent many years in my last 30 years in the House, not quite as long as the Honourable Gentleman, I think, from memory, looking at the problem of phosphorescent dyes getting into sewage works and into water streams. Phosphorescent dye is very popular in the clothing industry, but of course I'd be happy to do that. Mr. Hosey, I want to turn to, based on what I've said, to the importance of the UK having a sustainable healthcare policy. Now, at the moment, 1/3 of the world's population is already has in part a sustainable healthcare system. The two most populated countries in the world, colleagues will recall, are China and India. China has 1,400 million population and India 1,300 million. And China has already 65,000 hospitals which use sustainable treatments. And I think the challenge for us, and I say to my honourable friend on the front bench, in this country is to develop or take forward for a small base zero-carbon medicines and zero-carbon healthcare. We cannot ignore this subject. In China, there are 65,000 hospitals that are using zero-carbon treatments in the shape of acupuncture. They also use traditional Chinese medicine, which is a herbal medicine, Mr. Hosey. The carbon footprint is close to zero. In India, they are, I have to say to my honourable friend, light years ahead, because not only do they have a family's health ministry, but they have a ministry called Ayush, which is a sustainable health ministry, very much supported by Prime Minister Modi, who has just won election for another 5 years. And this ministry, the Sustainable Healthcare Ministry called Ayush, has seen its budget increase 4 times in the last 6 years. So I have to say to my honourable friend on the front bench and to you, Mr. Hosey, it's a mystery to me why it is that the authorities in this country, NICE, NHS England, and to a certain extent the department, do not look far afield beyond our country as to what is happening in other parts of the world and take note of it. And I'd like to comment on NICE's decision to query the effectiveness of acupuncture for lower back pain, a zero-carbon treatment. And when I asked him in January at a committee meeting here whether he'd looked at evidence from China, he said no, on cost grounds, and admittedly their costs have been reduced. But I think that is a mistake. I think we should be looking further afield. Mr. Hosey, today the head of NHS England has made a blanket attack on homeopaths over the issue of vaccinations. I personally support the Mail campaign for vaccinations. I think it is a good campaign. But what I think is mistaken is to attack a movement. particularly, again, if we'd only look abroad, Mr. Hosey, at what happens in India, bearing in mind that homeopathy, and I'm not going to dwell on it for long, is a zero-carbon treatment. Some would say there's nothing there, but in Delhi, there are 6,000 clinics and 15,000 registered practitioners, 80% are doctors, with 5 years training. In Calcutta, I went to a clinic there which is treating 2,000 patients a day in off-season with 100 doctors on duty each day. Now, I really think that we should look at this, and I'll just finish on the homeopathic thing on this. There are, in the whole of India, 300,000 homeopathic practitioners, 250,000 of which are doctors with 5 years training. How can it be that at a time of environmental crisis and the shocking carbon footprint in the health service, we're not taking this, the second largest medical system in the world, seriously? And I have to say that I think the head of our health service, Simon Stevens, has been very badly advised. And I say the same to Andrew Dillon. I think they've been badly advised. They should get out there and see what's happening in the rest of the world and bury their prejudices. Mr. Hosey, I met, and I'd like to thank Sripad Naik, the Minister in charge of Ayush, Dr. Raja Kateka, his secretary, and Pramad Pathak, his Assistant Secretary, for the courtesy extended to me when I visited the ministry on a week-long tour of facilities in India. I'm most grateful to them, and I wish them well as they look after their 700,000 practitioners, 700 teaching institutions, 200 postgraduate institutions, and manage 46,000 degree courses with an annual intake of 6,000 students, with 28,000 dispensaries and 9,000 government manufacturing units. And they provide 6 practitioners per 10,000 population. This is what we should be looking at. Mr. Hosey, there are colleagues here who wish to speak, and I certainly do not want to monopolise this afternoon. We have to, I suggest, broaden the scope of our environmental thinking to look at the whole issue of healthcare. I'm not sure I've seen this elsewhere, but I do think we need to think about zero-carbon treatments and zero-carbon medicines, and they are out there, used by 1/3 of the population of the world. So we need to wise up, as my kids say. Daddy, wise up. We need to take note that 3 babies a day are born addicted to opioid drugs. We need to realise the new antibiotics we need are not coming online fast enough, and we have to go back to the future, if I can quote, I think it's Alvin Toffler, isn't it? And look for new solutions in 4,000-year-old medical systems. And if we do, we will have a happier, healthier world with a better carbon footprint.
Amy McCarthy.
Mr. Hosey, it's a pleasure to see you in the chair. I think the parliamentary authorities are doing their bit to combat global warming by not having the heating on today. So I sent for my cardigan. I'll survive. The honourable member who just spoke made an interesting speech, slightly imaginative interpretation perhaps of the subject of the petition, but I would say to him the Environmental Audit Committee that I sit on, as part of its greening government inquiry, is looking at the environmental footprint of the NHS estates. So some of those issues are coming up as part of that, and I think all areas of government need to look at how they can reduce their carbon footprint. But turning to the petition today, it had 405 signatories from Bristol East, and I know many of my constituents are passionate about this issue. I'm very pleased that we are talking about rewilding as a natural climate solution now. It can draw millions of tonnes of carbon from the atmosphere. I do agree with what the Honourable Member for Brighton Pavilion had to say, is that we need to look at both sides of the coin, though, because sometimes I find that when I take part in these debates, particularly when I talk about agriculture and the footprint, we had a debate here in this chamber 3 weeks ago about deforestation of the Amazon, and there can quite often be a focus on the positive side, well, let's restore our soil, let's plant lots of trees, without actually addressing the fact that there's huge amounts of destruction going on, and there's not much point planting trees if, with the other hand, you're destroying the Amazon to grow soya for livestock feed or whatever.
Just on that point, do we have to actually go to the Amazon? I hate to say that one of my leading professors at Cambridge, who's a great friend of mine, Professor Steve Evans, actually believes that soil degradation here at home and worldwide is probably the greatest challenge that we face at this moment. Actually, what we grow our plants and trees in.
Yeah, I mean, soil's a huge issue, and both the Environmental Audit Committee did a very good inquiry into it a few years ago, and the All-Party Group for Agroecology, which I chair, also did a three-part inquiry. And it was one of the amendments I tried to get through into the Agriculture Bill with the list of public money for public goods, was to say that soil ought to be identified, better soil health, identified as a particular public good. Now, the Minister's response, the Farming Minister's response, was that actually it was covered by the broader list and they didn't want to be too specific. But now that the who knows if the Agriculture Bill is coming back? Who knows if we'll even be here tomorrow, let alone in time for the Agriculture Bill to come back? But I would like to see that spelt out more specifically and in the Environment Bill too. As the petition stated, we do need to act fast to avoid a climate emergency, and reducing carbon emissions alone will not be enough to keep the heating of the planet below 1.5 degrees centigrade. We also need to find ways of removing carbon from the atmosphere, and nature is our greatest ally in doing that. Evidence suggests natural climate solutions could provide over a third of the greenhouse gas mitigation required globally between now and 2030. Yet at the moment, natural solutions currently only receive 2.5% of the funding spent globally on cutting emissions. And I think the lack of focus on natural solutions is indicative of the wider lack of action on reversing the ecological crisis over the past 40 years.
On that point and earlier about the deforestation, here, actually at home, in terms of carbon sequestration, peat bogs play a hugely important role. Shouldn't the government be investing more in restoring peat bogs in the UK?
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think there should be a ban on the burning of blanket bogs. I will have something to say about grouse moors in a moment, but also peat in horticultural products. There's been quite a campaign to stop that. I know quite a lot of gardeners would support that. I think that's all part and parcel of it. The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services found that 1 million species already face extinction, many within decades, unless action is taken. It's a very sad fact that the UK is now one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world, ranked 189th out of 218, with a 41% species decline since 1970. And many of us are species champion. I'm the parliamentary Swift species champion. I know that other people are doing really good work on that front, but and it's now more on the political agenda, but it is still shocking how much damage has been done in recent decades. It's clear that nature is struggling against climate change, habitat loss, pollution, intensive farming, but we can turn this around radically by changing the way that we manage our land. And rewilding is the only solution that offers the opportunity to tackle the climate and ecological emergencies together. The benefits of rewilding are peatlands, heathland, grasslands, woodlands, salt marshes, wetlands and coastal waters are diverse. It would lock away carbon, clean air and water, reconnect us with nature, protect communities at risk of flooding, revitalise wildlife, restore our soil, support new economic opportunities. I would say I was actually reading, in preparation for this speech, I was reading an article by the Minister's brother, Ben, that was titled The Triumphant Return of the British Beaver. That was in The Spectator. And there was a quote from it. He was saying that some people say, well, beavers are just all a bit messy, aren't they? And I think that is something. It's the same sort of thing we were talking about when we were talking about the grass verges. And I do get some constituents that say that now that the grass in the parks and along the roadsides aren't cut to within, a centimetre of their life. It all looks a bit messy with all this stuff growing, but that's what nature ought to look like. And Ben Goldsmith, in response to people saying that beavers make a bit of a mess, said, considering that the majority of our land is stripped, cultivated, tidied and managed by humans, surely we can allow nature a bit of a free rein along our watercourses. And I think that is sort of pretty much underpinning this whole debate. Yeah. Nature ought to be allowed to do what nature does and not be controlled and tidied up and pubbled almost out of existence. So Peatland, my honourable friend from Leeds Northwest, is it? Has already mentioned Peatland. We're lucky that we have 13% of the world's peatland in the UK, but the habitat is suffering. 80% has been damaged by drainage, extraction, burning or overgrazing. And as a result, it's releasing emissions of around 660,000 UK households a year. Sorry, the equivalent of the emissions of 660,000 UK households. So you've got this natural resource that is capable of taking carbon out of the atmosphere, and instead, because of the way we treat it, it's releasing huge amount of emissions. The government should ban the extraction and burning of peat immediately. Extraction for garden compost is releasing almost 500,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide a year, which is the equivalent of 100,000 cars on the road. So why are we talking about cars all the time and not talking about how, just domestic gardening is causing a problem? Voluntary targets to phase out horticultural peat are not being met, and it's now been over a year and a half since the government said that progress was insufficient. So I think it's now time for action. Rewilding our peatlands is basically a no-brainer. It sequesters significant amounts of carbon, it provides clean water, it reduces flooding, and anyone who's been up to those flood-hit areas, as I went several years ago, around, say, with the honourable member for Halifax, and you see the impact of the burning of the moors on what happens in the catchment area. Just, again, it absolutely makes sense to be looking after our peatlands and to be planting trees, so on. I just want to say a little bit about farming. It's some critics of the rewilding agenda would say that it's a choice between feeding ourselves and nature. If you're talking about turning more land over to rewilding rather than using it for agriculture, we will lose out in terms of food security and so on. But often it's the least productive marginal land that provides the best options for carbon sequestration, rewilding and other ecosystem services. We already have large areas of land that produce little food that could be used to store vast amounts of carbon. Grouse moor estates cover around 1.3 million hectares of England, Scotland and Wales. Deer stalking estates account for around 1.8 million hectares in Scotland. These estates are commonly on degraded peatlands, currently managed at high environmental cost, using practices such as burning, for the benefit of a relatively tiny number of shooters. I think we need to reassess our priorities and take a more strategic approach to the use of that land. I also want to say a little bit about nature and climate-friendly farming. As I said, I chair the all-party group on agroecology for sustainable food and farming, which I have to say does excellent work on this agenda. And if we are looking at, and the Minister was until his elevation to greater things, one of the vice-chairs of the all-party group, I think, the uptake of rewilding must also be accompanied by a wider transition to nature and climate-friendly farming. For example, the Knepp estate is a really good example of how that works. It's well documented that the intensification of farming since the Second World War has provided less and less space for nature in this country. And to turn that around, the government ought to commit to a transition to sustainable agroecological farming by 2030, and that's supported by the RSA's Food, Farming and Countryside Commission. They also need to commit to net zero emissions from agriculture by 2040 and reverting parcels of arable land, particularly the third used for animal feed, back to permanent grassland, which has high levels of soil, carbon and biodiversity value. As I've mentioned the agriculture bill with the public money for public goods approach, I think that's a step in the right direction, but it does need to be more ambitious. If £1.9 billion of the £3 billion currently spent on cap payments were allocated to supporting native woodland re-establishment, the restoration and protection of peat bogs and heaths and species-rich grasslands over a total of 6 million hectares, That could sequester 47 million tonnes of CO2 a year. That is more than a tenth of current UK greenhouse gas emissions. As I alluded to in my opening, we can't just think about natural solutions on a domestic level. The UK should also play its part on the world stage by ensuring that all UK aid is nature positive. I know this is something the Minister, with his DFID Minister hat on, and thinks is important too. We need to support more integrated interventions that improve people's lives and enhance the natural environment. We need to stop harmful investments that destroy nature and contribute to climate change, such as the deforestation of the Amazon. We need to look at how our consumption patterns here are harming the environment overseas. We need to negotiate an ambitious deal for people and nature at the Convention on Biological Biodiversity next October. And we need to look at other countries that are already leading by example on rewilding. Ethiopia planted more than 350 million trees in a day in July, with, God knows how they managed that, but that's what they did, with the aim of planting 4 billion in the next year. And that scale of ambition is something that we should seek to follow. So to conclude, Mr Hosey, the UK does have the chance to become a world leader in natural climate solutions, but we do need financial commitments from the government. Markets alone will not solve the climate and ecological crisis. Next week, assuming we're still here, the government has the chance to prove its commitment by guaranteeing... Oh, actually, this is a reference to the budget, and the budget's definitely not happening next week, is it? So, well, anyway, at some point in the near future, hopefully, if there's not an election, the government has the chance to prove its commitment by guaranteeing at least £2.9 billion for the new Environmental Land Management Scheme, as called for by the National Trust, RSPB and Wildlife Trusts in the budget, whenever that happens. It could also reverse the 42% funding fall as a percentage of GDP for biodiversity conservation since 2008. So just with the final thought, I would say taking a different approach to the way land is managed is as important as high-tech solutions to addressing climate breakdown. I've heard the Minister for Climate Change talk about some sort of weird technological advances that would suck carbon out of the air. I don't see why we need to do that when we've got trees and peat bogs that can do the job for that. Thank you.
Caroline Noakes.
Thank you, Mr Hosey. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon, and also to follow the Honourable Lady for Bristol East, who serves on the Environmental Audit Committee. When I was first in this place, I was also a member of the Environmental Audit Committee alongside the Minister, and many a jolly afternoon we spent debating a wide range of subjects and doing various inquiries. I wanted to focus my remarks this afternoon, and I fear this might become a march around my constituency, because in the words of Debbie Tan, who is the Chief Exec of the Hanson Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust, actually we have to look to local solutions. Whilst the big national picture is absolutely crucial, actually within all of our own constituencies we can make sure that there are good and important projects that are going on. And I wanted to focus first on trees, Mr Hosey. And I think it was a fortnight ago, Extinction Rebellion came to Westminster and provided each of us with a tree, perhaps not wholly sustainable in a plastic pot of the single-use variety, but actually I was struck that we had this image across Portcullis House of Burnham Wood coming to Dunsinane as these walking trees were paraded through the building. And the humble oak tree, a fantastic symbol of our countryside, is of course one of the best carbon reservoirs that we can possibly have. I was a little disappointed that afternoon. I didn't get an oak tree. I only got a beech tree, but I say only. It was one that I very proudly took home and made sure was planted in my constituency. But if we focus on the oak, of course, these are trees which grow for 200 years, they live for 200 years, and they die for 200 years, which is why it is so crucially important that we are planting the whole time and making sure that there is a replenished stock. Because actually it is not just that my honourable friend mentioned the Department of Health as being an important partner with DEFRA when it comes to the environment. We also must look to the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, because they have an absolutely crucial role to play when making sure that our natural environment is working hand in hand with the built environment to make sure that we can address the challenge of climate change. And I am always struck, and I am blessed to represent a constituency that is very heavily treed, but in many instances there are examples of historic oak trees despite having TPOs, tree preservation orders, being chopped down. We have the relentless pressure to build more houses in areas where there is already a conflict between nature and the built environment. We have Valley Park woodlands, which are hard up against the 3,000 or so houses that are built in Valley Park, and the pressure that exists. And much of this debate is about balance. Of course, we have to provide houses, but we have to make sure that they're in the right place and that those houses have access to the natural environment so that people can enjoy the very special areas that must be preserved, but also have somewhere simply to walk their dogs. And of course, it doesn't always fit very easily that walking your dog in a triple SI is never a good idea. And there are many examples in my constituency where there are real pressures on Ramsar protected sites like we have in the New Forest and also Emma Bog in North Baddesley. So it's about providing the right facilities. I was struck, I spent 10 years as the Cabinet Member for Leisure on the local authority, and right at the end of that time we were heavily in negotiations with the local landowner to take possession of an area, Fishlake Meadows. And if you read the words of the Wildlife Trust, what they say about Fishlake Meadows is that it gives us a glimpse of how Tess Valley would have looked over 2,000 years ago. It's a dynamic shifting swathe of ponds, lakes, reedbed, willow scrub and fen grassland. But 20 years ago, that was farmed agricultural land. It was drained and ploughed and planted for food. Clearly, food that we didn't actually require. And actually, it's a much healthier environment now that it has been given back to nature and is functioning exactly as it should do as a flood prevention area for the town of Romsey, as somewhere where ospreys and otters and kingfishers can thrive. But of course it is about making sure that you have the right resources in place to be able to support that land and recognising, and I think there have been references to nature being tidied up this afternoon, but actually when we took possession of Fishlake Meadows, it was absolutely at a tipping point where if it had been left any longer, then nature would have, the balance would have tipped over into those invasive species which are not wholly desirable, and it would have been a much harder job to bring it back to the point that it is today. I also wish to pick up on some of the comments about farming. And it is very important that we reflect that agriculture can have a very important role for good. I was scheduled last Friday to visit Broughton water buffalo in my constituency. Now, who would have thought that Indian water buffalo would be providing so much good to the Hampshire countryside, yet they are being farmed completely sustainably in a method where the buffalo are only grass-fed and moved on to different pasture every single day, and the hay that they eat in the winter is grown on the farm. It is a place where over 15,000 trees have been planted over the course of the last few years, and an absolute example of how your local farmers can play a fantastic role in making sure that the environment is at the forefront and that climate change is uppermost in their thinking when deciding how they can make a return from their land whilst at the same time protecting it. Unfortunately, the weather last Friday was too miserable in Hampshire for me to be able to go, but it's certainly high on my list of priorities, and who knows, we may all have an opportunity over the course of the next few weeks to disappear back to our constituencies and stomp around in our wellies to our heart's content. The final point that I wanted to make was about volunteering. And we heard the suggestion that volunteers might be inclined to tidy up. But actually, when I look at both Valley Park woodlands, when I look at Fishlake Meadows, there has been a fantastic relationship built up with the local communities, with the local university, Southampton University. I am blessed to have that on the very edge of my constituency. And of course, it is in many instances students that have been at the forefront of making sure that nature is not tidied up, but that it is enhanced and it is given the opportunity to thrive as we would all want it to. The Minister will know very well that part of my constituency is on the edge of the New Forest, and we have heard a great deal about the reservoir of CO2 that peat bogs can provide. Now, in the New Forest, peat has not been burnt for many a long year, but there are still instances where peat will be dug quite illegally. And of course, there is a massive role for the National Park Authority to make sure that laws are adhered to and that peat bogs are restored and maintained. And yet again, that can provide some conflict. And I best declare an interest here as a member of the, and I'm going to get the name wrong, the New Forest it's not the Pony Breeding and Cattle Society, it's one of the other horsey societies in the New Forest, because there is a real conflict between the draining of some of the peat bogs, which us riders would love to happen to give us access to wider areas of the forest, but the crucial need as part of nature to make sure that doesn't happen, and that actually we have the correct management of those peat bogs to make sure that the mires and bogs stay as they should be. There have been many contributions this afternoon from people, honourable members, who were recognised a fortnight ago at the Species Champions Awards. And I'm just going to make a quick pitch for the Duke of Burgundy butterfly, of which I'm a species champion. I gather it is the most recovered pollinator over the last 12 months, and I would like to pretend that this was some great breeding programme of mine. Sadly, it is not, but it has been as a result of the warm summers that we have had, but also of the efforts that landowners have made to make sure that the habitats for that butterfly, which is extremely endangered, have been as they should be. Now, yet again, this is where farming can work hand in hand with nature, because it is actually coppiced hazel which provides the best environment for that butterfly. So it's important that forestry management does continue, but it needs to continue in a way that enables species and, so crucially, pollinators to thrive. I think I have probably said enough this afternoon, Mr. Hosey, but I very much welcome our ability this afternoon to recognise that there is a role to play for nature which can be so crucially important in making sure that it is used to the best of its ability to suck up the CO2. In the words of the Honourable Lady for Bristol East, we don't need any great technology to do that. Trees can do it for us.
Justin Matters.
Thank you, Mr. Hayes. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair. It's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Lady and reminding me of some pleasant holidays in the New Forest, where my wife always reminds me I fell off a bike, which she will now be delighted is on the public record. But I'd like to congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Cambridge, for the excellent way he introduced the debate today on behalf of the Petitions Committee. And as we know, these petitions have become a feature of this Parliament, an excellent way for the public to make sure that we hear their concerns and press us to take action. I think it's fair to say that we have had many representations in respect of the importance of climate change in the last year or two. But I think this is a particular aspect of it which we haven't probably touched on a great deal in the past. But I think it does show that the climate emergency is really fast coming up the agenda in terms of the public's priorities. And I think, for me, we're not going far enough, fast enough. Indeed, how many of us can say in our own lives we're doing absolutely all that we can to tackle climate change? And of course, Mr. Hosey, change should come from the top. As we know, the Committee on Climate Change report in May this year led to the UK adopting a net zero target by 2050, but they also found in their report that the government failing to prepare the country for the inevitable impact of climate change. And I think that failure is putting our communities and infrastructure at risk, because we know the consequences of our actions are with us now already. Over the last 2 decades, severe weather events across the country have cost an average of £1.5 billion per year. Only this weekend, Cheshire was subject to severe flooding in certain parts. But those figures will be dwarfed in coming years by the overall cost and effect of climate change. Cost to our environment, of course, as well, and of course the human cost, because all over the globe, swathes of land will, I think, become uninhabitable. And we know that if we don't take action now, then the effects in this country alone will see a predicted trebling of deaths in relation to heat by 2050, far more frequent flooding and food insecurity. And this is a matter of national security, food security. It is an emergency, and of course we may well be one of the more fortunate countries in terms of the impact of climate change. We can't and we shouldn't act alone, but that should not be an excuse for us failing to take a lead. Why are we still financing fossil fuel projects overseas? According to Christian Aid, the UK government as a whole is still spending more on fossil fuels than renewable energy in developing countries. How is that setting an example? That is not, in my opinion, leadership on this issue. What does that say to the likes of China and India, whose CO2 emissions dwarf our own? is our desperation to seal trade agreements with these countries, should we ever leave the EU, going to inhibit our ability to talk candidly with them about their need to change tack 2, and I take particular regard to the United States in respect of that. And we know that our own homes, our workplaces and other infrastructure need to be prepared for unavoidable climate impacts. And yet the committee's report also tells us that the government funding to help service and support regions, businesses and individuals has ceased. There's been a failure to start the critical conversations that we need to have with the public over the necessary changes of behaviour that need to be done. How, in those circumstances, are we really going to be able to equip our communities to meet the challenges of reducing carbon emissions and removing carbon from our atmosphere? So we know that natural climate solutions do increase carbon capture and carbon capture and storage can play a very important role in getting us to net zero. Rewilding and other natural climate solutions can be used to draw potentially millions of tonnes of CO2 out of the air and actually restore and protect our living systems. Indeed, new research estimates that a worldwide planting programme could remove 2/3 of all the emissions that have been pumped into the atmosphere by human activities. And of course, to do that, we need to really prioritise the environment. And it's the case that there was a manifesto pledge from the Conservatives to plant 11 million trees, which was made during the last election. I don't know if the Minister can update us on the figures today, but I think we are some way short of that at the moment. And I think it's also the case that tree planting targets have been missed every year since they were set in 2013. Tree planting in England fell short of targets in the last year, with less than one of the 1,500 hectares of the government's 5,000 hectares being planted. And the UK only has at the moment 13% of our overall land area covered by trees, which compared to other European countries is well below. It's on average about 35% across Europe, and that's simply not going to be good enough in the challenges we face. We often trade numbers across the chamber about the number of operations done, about the number of homes built, or numbers of police that we have. But I would say that perhaps the real sign of change in here was when we begin to trade insults over the number of trees that we've actually planted in each form of government. And I think that would be a real sign that there is a real commitment on both sides to take this issue seriously. And that's why campaigners are calling the government's commitments on this painfully slow and are calling for a new strategy to enable this target to be met. The Woodland Trust have called for much greater government support, and I echo their calls. I'm pleased that my own party has pledged to be more ambitious, and I refer to my honourable friend, the member for Leicester South's pledge last month that a Labour government would plant 1 million trees in hospitals throughout the UK. I think that's a very innovative and interesting way of looking at things. There can be some departmental leads taken here as well. And also, I was also pleased to put my name to a letter from my honourable friend, the member for Barnsley Central, in support of the Northern Forest. Again, that's an initiative spearheaded by the Woodland Trust, which aims to plant 50 million trees in the north of England. It's said that this Northern Forest would generate around £2.5 billion worth of social, economic and environmental benefits. That's at least a 5-fold return on investment, and that sounds like a win-win situation to me, and it's something I hope that we can all support. In addition to these ambitious plans, we're also pleased that the Labour Party have got a pledge to ban all harmful pesticides like neonicotinoids, which, of course, we believe pose a serious risk of harm to honey, bees and other pollinators. And we shouldn't underestimate the importance of the ecosystem with wildflowers. And I think we know that if we don't get that right, there's a risk to the entire food chain. And I'd like to congratulate, actually, in that regard, my local authority, Cheshire West and Chester Council, for some of the work they've been doing in respect of bulb planting and also allowing certain sections of the highway verges to grow wild. Certainly it works for me in terms of the aesthetics of it. It's not to everyone's cup of tea, but I think it does actually add a little bit of colour, and it also adds a little bit of pollen into the ecosystem, and I think that's something we can all learn from. So one of the chief recommendations of the 30 by 2030 report launched by my honourable friend, the member for Salford, the Shadow Business Secretary last week, was talking about sourcing 90% of electricity from renewables and low-carbon sources by 2030. This includes carbon capture and storage, with a goal of expanding it to become a significant component of the energy mix by the late 2020s. And on this front, I was pleased to learn about a carbon capture, usage and storage initiative for the North West, which is actually based in my own constituency. The HyNet proposals will be based around the key industrial cluster located around the Mersey estuary, which alongside state-of-the-art hydrogen production in the long run. At the moment, we have about 5% of the UK's energy output in this area due to the high concentration of very energy-intensive industry. But its location actually also brings with it an opportunity, because there is the ability there to repurpose the Liverpool Bay oil and gas infrastructure to divert around 1 million tonnes of CO2 per year into those oil fields. That would be the equivalent, Mr Hosey, of taking 600,000 cars off the road. And ultimately, this proposal has the potential to take 10 million tonnes of CO2 out of the atmosphere a year, which would, of course, make a huge contribution to reducing our emissions. It's also got economic benefits. It's got the potential to create around 5,000 jobs between now and 2025. And the key to this is to finalise business models quickly to bring forward some first stages of industrial development, so we can actually start to realise the impressive ambitions that a whole range of players in the local sector have come forward to introduce. So I believe that, you know, these plants have a big role to play in carbon capture, but also in taking us away from CO2 and getting our economy more involved in hydrogen. And I would hope that we can discuss with relevant ministers, it's probably Bayes rather than the minister before us, how we can bring that forward as soon as possible. And I believe this country has an opportunity to become a world leader in climate solutions, but it can only be achieved by strengthening policy to deliver emissions reductions across all levels of government and government department. I think delivery must be taken much more as a matter of urgency, and we can also do our part at other levels of government. So let's take planning, for example, something my honourable friend, the member for Stalybridge and Hyde, referred to earlier on. Planning isn't normally a party political background, but I believe it's one area, if it's used really innovatively, it could really drive this agenda forward. I've long held the view that we should be doing an awful lot more to require developers to future-proof developments, not only in terms of the environment, but also in terms of climate risk. But we should not just look at the bricks and mortar of the homes, but we should also look at how these estates are designed. And I actually reflect back at the way some planning decisions from decades ago may affect things now, because I see some of the estates that were built in the 1960s, and I see how the trees that were obviously put in there as young saplings at the time have now grown out of all proportion to the surrounding houses. They're often too unwieldy really to be of use, and they damage the nearby properties, and the roots have to be cut and then they have to be taken down, and some of them get diseased. And I think that it's something we could probably have a little bit more forethought about. So let's make sure that not only developments that are built now have a minimum number of trees that are built in the common areas, but let's actually make sure that they're ones that will grow in sympathy with their surroundings. Let's think about 20 or 30 years ahead and what those trees will look like. And there's no good reason either why industrial developments or office blocks can't have trees and plants designed into their features as well. And also, when we're looking at new developments, let's look at transport, because that's a key factor. And there is evidence that improved bus networks can reduce carbon emissions. Fully loaded double-decker bus takes 75 cars off the road on average, and vehicle occupancy for buses and cars can move 10 times as many people as a car can. And the benefits of a renaissance in bus travel, I think, are very clear in terms of reducing CO2. But I do wonder whether people who set climate policy in London do really understand it's not quite as easy to get around on public transport in the rest of the country. Try getting a bus after 6 o'clock at night in my constituency or on a Sunday. It soon becomes apparent that if your shift pattern at work is not 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, you need a car. And we absolutely need to boost local bus services, And actually, that's something that we can do in a way that will really help us tackle CO2 emissions. So in conclusion, Mr. Hosey, I think it's sad to say that the previous generation of politicians have failed to address the enormity of what we are now facing, and we are sleepwalking into a climate catastrophe that unless we really begin to face up to the fact that carbon reduction needs to be done now, then we will be the last generation who enjoy the benefits of industrialisation, and we will be the ones imposing on the next generation the consequences of our indolence. This is not about some future theoretical prospect. It's happening now. We see it all around us. We see it around the world: fires, droughts, cyclones. The warnings from the scientists are crystal clear. We will only see more and more of those incidents unless we begin to tackle these issues with urgency. And we shouldn't hesitate in calling this an emergency. I know people will say words can be spoken here and they don't really change anything. And maybe at the moment they've got a point about that. But we must show people we can do better, and we have a real commitment from the heart of government to tackle climate change. And a substantial British Green New Deal will be central to that. It will reduce emissions, it will actually create employment and show to the rest of the world that economic benefit and climate benefit are not mutually exclusive. And we do need to recognise the reason why we're here now is because there have been several centuries of a relentless pursuit of economic growth without any thought to the environmental consequences of it. Of course, there have been so many advances made in that time, it would be wrong to suggest that economic growth is a bad thing, but it's no longer tenable to consider economic advancement in isolation. I believe the scale of the challenge we face from climate change should lead us to say that restoring nature is as much an economic imperative as a moral one.
John McNally.
Thank you, Mr Hosey. It's always a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I too congratulate the member for Cambridge for securing today's very topical debate and for taking so many interventions earlier on with great patience, I have to say. I'd also like to declare a non-financial interest. I'm a member of the Community Along the Cairn Association project in Falkirk area and also the Community Green Initiative. And I'd also like to say, if we are still here next week, I'd like to invite members to attend the inaugural APPG on Youth Climate Action on the 5th of November at 12 noon. And I just can't quite remember exactly where it is. And I'd also like to congratulate specifically the member for Bristol East. She mentioned the importance of peat bogs, and as you probably know, Scotland has the largest peat bog in the whole of Europe, and we cherish its magnificence and its beauty. Chair, people and nature. Restore nature on a massive scale to help stop climate change breakdown. It's a very straightforward petition, and petitioners are to be congratulated on their clarity of purpose and their aims. Who wouldn't agree with this ambition? Chair, a world conversion is taking place across the planet. We're at a pivotal moment in time, and the UK Government must realise the importance of the petition, and the presence of MPs here attending this debate tonight emphasises the actual importance of that petition. The petition calls for the UK Government to financially and politically commit to supporting natural climate solutions that can draw millions of tonnes of CO2 from the air. And the UK Government supports the need to combat deforestation and to promote sustainable forests. Chair, all evidence before us shows that urgency is required to face this climate and biodiversity emergency head-on. All governments have to ask the difficult question. The question is very simple. If we are to allow a crisis that is hitting the poorest people and countries the hardest to continue to do so would surely be a sin. And surely the answer has to be a resounding no to that continuation. So why undermine IC finance contributions by UK actions elsewhere? For example, in last week's debate I mentioned that the UK consumed 3.3 million tonnes of soy per year from the lungs of the world, the rainforest, the Amazon regions, for animal feed. Surely the UK could take steps to stop that practice immediately. And I'd love to ask the Minister if he could respond to us to tell us exactly what the UK Government is doing to address this unsustainable practice. Mr Hosey, if I may, I'd like to move on to what Scotland is actually doing. The Scottish Government is determined to lead by example by measuring and enhancing our own natural capital. By doing so, we will benefit the ecosystems and people of our own country, and we will also do our bit to help the environment and well-being of the wider world. Scotland's biodiversity is at the heart of a thriving, sustainable Scotland. Initiatives worth mentioning are the marine protected areas, the introduction of white-tailed eagles, beavers are now flourishing back in Scotland. Scotland is taking a leading role in reducing carbon emissions and promoting one of the most ambitious climate change strategies of any country in the world. Studies suggest that the elements of Scotland's natural capital can be given a monetary value of worth more than £20 billion each year to our economy and start supporting more than 60,000 jobs. The Environmental and Resource Economics Project report for the Scottish Environment Protection Agency concluded that the economic value of ecosystem services can be estimated at £21.5 to £23 billion per year to Scotland. Quite staggering figures, aren't they? Many of Scotland's growth sectors, such as tourism, food and drink, depend on the high-quality air, land and water. ONS figures reported the equivalent of 21,500 full-time jobs in Scotland's low-carbon economy, showing that this strong emissions reductions are fully compatible with an economically thriving nation. Scotland has met its targets of 11,200 hectares of new tree plantings, a significant increase on 2017, and plans to increase the targets further in 2024 from 10,000 to 15,000 hectares. The new legislative framework is the toughest, most ambitious in the world, with the new 75% target for 2030 going far beyond what the IPCC special report says is needed globally to prevent warming of more than 1.5 degrees. Our end target of net zero emissions of all greenhouse gases by 2045 is 5 years ahead of the rest of the UK, and it's firmly based on what the Committee on Climate Change advised and is the limit of what can be currently achieved. And being mindful of other issues and unafraid to face up to difficult questions, Chair, poor air quality remains an issue in a number of towns and cities in Scotland and across Scotland, and effective change is needed now so that all of us can breathe clean air and lead healthy lives in the future. And bearing that in mind, the Scottish Government's ambition is that Scotland's air quality should be the best in Europe. And as part of the Cleaner Air for Scotland Governance Group, we have also incorporated the British Heart Foundation, which will also help to bring a fresh perspective to the issue. So to conclude, we are encouraging reduction of energy use and promoting better choices to prevent harmful emissions and protecting what nature has to offer. All of us have to face up to possible risks to the environment now and in the future. Mr Hosey, any lowering of environmental standards post-Brexit will not be tolerated in Scotland. Thank you.
Pollard.
Thank you very much, Mr Hosey, and I'd like to thank my honourable friend from Cambridge for introducing this debate so well. He speaks with such passion in his calm and mannered speech that actually many of the points he raised in there actually set up the debate really nicely for what was, I think, a good debate on all sides of the House. It is quite common in Westminster Hall that there is consensus across both sides of the House. And if only BBC Parliament and the news channels showed more of what was going on in here, less so of what was going on in the main chamber, then they would see politics at its best. Because actually many of the debates that take place in here do get into the detail and the intricacies and do encourage the ministers to look at some of the detail, not just the sound bites that matter. And when we're looking at rewilding and restoring nature, it is in many cases the detail that does matter about this, because it is easy to put big picture phraseologies around how we want to restore nature and we want to rewild, and let's insert a very large number of trees and say we're going to plant this. But actually it's the detail and delivery that makes a really big difference, because I think it is worth saying, and it has been said by colleagues on both sides of this debate, that climate change is real. In Parliament, businesses, local government and in all our communities, we're now confronted by a very pressing question. Since Parliament has declared a climate emergency, what are you doing differently? And if the answer is nothing, as frequently it is, then that's not a good enough answer. And when it comes to restoring nature, that means not only looking at how we reverse the biodiversity loss in rural areas, but it's how we reverse the biodiversity loss in urban areas as well. What role can our brilliant local councils play, as well as central government, businesses, voluntary groups, the third sector and cooperatives and mutuals as well. There are lots of challenges, and it is up to each and every one of us to do so. And that is why, when the Shadow DEFRA team talks about the climate emergency, my honourable friends from Workington and from Stroud are always very keen to mention the phrase that my friend from Bristol East used in her remarks, that this is a climate and ecological emergency. Because if we focus solely around carbon, we will miss part of the debate. And that's why we need to look at habitat loss, biodiversity loss, problems with our soil, and so much more besides. Indeed, this is an issue that matters to all of us, no matter where we live. We know that what catastrophe awaits us if we don't act sooner. And as my old friend from Ellesmere Port mentioned in his remarks, that we're already seeing the effects of that now. If we do not drastically cut the amount of carbon we produce, sea level rises, extreme weather, population movements, large parts of our planet, our home becoming inhospitable and unlivable, in particular in this debate, we'll see greater biodiversity loss, habitat loss, and the extinction of countless animal, insect, fish, and plant species. Indeed, while this debate has been going on, according to the latest diverse loss, we would have lost a couple of species from around the world. That shows just how pressing this is. And many of those species might not be household names. We've had good debates in here. Indeed, the Minister was a part of those about around the ivory ban, about the loss of some really flagship species. You know, the elephant, the rhino, due to hunting and activities. But actually, as we saw from the honourable member for Leeds North West, who led a debate in this place very recently about the loss of insects, many of those small insects that many of us won't know the names of are just as important to our economy as we go along. And that's why I think it was good that so many people in this debate talked about why rewilding was good. The contributions that we had, not only from my old friend from Bristol East, Ellesmere Port, and from Romsey and Southampton North, talked about their activities in their own constituencies, highlighting best practice. But we also saw contributions that talked around big themes. And so I was very glad that the honourable lady from Chatham and Elsford mentioned about green walls in schools and roadside planting, because frequently it's not just about big schemes, it can be about small things that all add up as well. My old friend from Enfield Southgate's contribution about the requirement that we need to have more nature-based solutions is at the heart of what we're talking about here, because frequently we get very good language but not enough action that follows from it. And that is why we do need to say that rewilding and restoring nature is good. It is something that we should be promoting much more of, and it is something that is a really important part of a nature-led solution to the climate and ecological emergency, which we need much more about. Now, the honourable member from Romsey spoke very passionately about the importance of trees in the debate, and indeed on this side of the House there's contributions about the variety of trees as well, because we not only need to plant more trees, Sir David, we need to make sure that the species that we're planting don't contribute to a monospecies environment where it's harder for insects, bird life and other plants to thrive. We need to have a mixed approach to this. Now that in some cases makes it slightly more expensive to plant, because you're not ordering 1 million trees of the same species, you're ordering different species along the way. But that creates the truly unique environment. And actually, we know from the research that tree planting, where you plant multiple species alongside each other, sequests more carbon and is a home for more animal life in particular than having tree species of the same variety in the same location. So when we're talking about tree planting, we need to make sure that we're talking about the true diversity of that. And I think the government says a lot of good words when it comes to tree planting, and indeed their manifesto commitment about planting so many trees, as raised by my old friend from Ellesmere Port, was a positive one. It is just a shame that we haven't seen the action around it. Now, I know the Minister will not be accepting any greenwash in his department, but all too lately we have, unfortunately, when it comes to tree planting, had very, very bold soundbites and very, very poor delivery. And I'll be grateful if the Minister could set out how he intends to reverse that when he comes to his conclusion. The mention about the importance of sequestering carbon in our forests is really important. And indeed, my friend from Bristol East spoke about the importance and the opportunity of sequestering so much more in our natural environment that could come from a potential agriculture, a change in agricultural setting. I look forward to the agriculture bill coming, and indeed, as the Shadow Minister for Fisheries, I also look forward to the fisheries bill coming. Two very important bills that have been hamstrung by the Brexit paralysis that we do need to see because of the impacts on our natural environment and our coastal and rural communities as well. Now, many of the members in this debate also spoke about the importance of re-wetting our peat bogs and preventing the burning of our grouse moors. Now, that was a policy that my party launched during the summer, and there was a day when I spent the entire day at BBC Plymouth speaking to different radio shows and different TV stations, talking about why moving driven grouse shooting, for instance, by changing the economy and the approach around driven grouse shooting could create additional biodiversity in those rural areas. And that is an approach that not only works on driven grouse shooting, but should also work when we're looking at rewilding of other forms of our natural environment. And here it's important not to just make the case for a rural environment, it's important to make a case for an urban and rural environment as well, because we need to enhance biodiversity in all those settings. And indeed, as the majority of our population live in urban environments, it's important that the activities that we have as individuals can take place in the areas where we live and not just the areas where we want to visit or where we might think of when we talk about those natural environments some more. The member for North East Hertfordshire, who's unfortunately not in his place anymore, was very bold when he called for a policy for water. And indeed, the government's policies for water, I think, are far too managerial when it comes to response to climate change. And I think that would be an area that I would encourage the new minister to give his department a little kick for, because I think there is an opportunity to go much further. The over-extraction of water from our chalk streams, for instance, carries an awful lot of headlines, and rightly so, because that is an area where there is severe damage being done to our chalk streams. And it's not just those fantastic figures like Fergal Sharkey that campaign on those areas. There's local groups right across our chalk stream communities who are really concerned about what is happening in those really precious and unique environments that we need to do so much more about. Happy giving away that point.
Caroline. I thank him for giving way and representing, as I do, the finest chalk stream in the world, the River Test. I think I would just like to add that it's not simply abstraction that is one of our big challenges, but the very significant problem we have with nitrates going into our watercourses, which is causing huge challenges locally.
Mr. Luke. I thank the Honourable Member for that intervention, and she's exactly right when it comes to it. Frequently in these problems, when it comes to biodiversity loss and habitat loss, the problems are always and rather than or, and indeed the solutions are always and rather than or as well. That does give me an opportunity to mention the contribution from the Honourable Member for Bosworth. I fear he may have stumbled into the incorrect debate for most of his remarks. However, when he did talk about the pharmaceutical effluent seeping into waterways, he was raising actually a very important point. And the new Minister hasn't yet had an opportunity to sit in the Statutory Instrument Committee with me when I talk about water quality, but in those days, which I'm sure will be coming up very soon, he will know of my concerns about coked up eels in the River Thames in particular, for whom cocaine passed through by human behaviour is causing some quite severe consequences for our marine life. And although coked up eels is a phraseology that sometimes attracts the attention of our friends in the media, the impact of human behaviour on the natural environment is something that I know he'll be very familiar with. So, David, in my last few remarks, I would just want to mention one part of the petition that hasn't really been picked up in the contributions so far. The petitioners, at the start of the petition, spoke about the those who manage land and our sea play a pivotal role and should be supported to come together to deliver carbon reductions. And indeed, there was a very helpful briefing paper sent round by WWF before this debate about the importance of seagrass replanting as well, because the majority of the debates when we talk about carbon sequestration tend to be focused on tree planting. And that's for good reasons. Trees are part of our natural environment. We drive past them, we walk past them, we cycle past them, we have them in our own gardens, in our parks. They are something vivid and indelibly part of a solution. But when we look at seagrasses, that can sequester 35 times more carbon than equivalent tree planting in the Amazon, for instance. There's huge opportunity to expand our seagrass replanting, and indeed that's what's taking place in Plymouth Sound National Marine Park, the country's first national marine park in the constituency that I represent. The reintroduction and replanting of seagrass and kelp forests have a hugely important part to play in not only the biodiversity and the fantastic marine species that we have in our coastal waters, but in sequestering carbon, because we can't underestimate the importance of the oceans in playing a part in climate change. The oceans have saved our bacon so many times when it's come to climate change because of the amount of carbon that the oceans themselves absorb. That is leading to ocean acidification and in that a loss of habitats, as we're seeing right around the world. So we do need to look at how, in sequestering more carbon, we're not only focusing, as the government has rightly done in its headline policy, on tree planting, but I would like to see the government look at how, through its marine policy, both in terms of the UK's coastal waters and indeed, as I know the Minister has an interest in our waters around our overseas territories further afield, we can look at how seagrass planting, kelp planting and other marine plant forms can contribute to not only habitat restoration, providing a nursery for many fish and other marine life, but also providing an opportunity to sequester so much of that carbon that we have spoken about. If we do not act quickly, climate change will be irreversible. And that is why all those topics that we've spoken about today, from the actions from ministerial level down to the actions of local groups and wildlife groups that we've heard spoken about so much today, is so important. The answer here is we all must do more to tackle climate change. We all must recognise that the climate emergency means the way we live, work, travel and play needs to change. And that is why the direction set by ministers is so important. Under the previous regime, we had countless consultations from DEFRA, but not enough action. And I hope in the new era, with the Minister in place, that will end the greenwashing and the obsession with press releases, and hopefully the start of the era of acting properly with swiftness and urgency that we need for the climate emergency will have truly begun. Thank you, Sir David.
Yeah. Minister. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair, Sir David. And I want to congratulate the Honourable Member for Cambridge on securing this debate, and it is similarly a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport, who's given a typically wide-ranging, thoughtful and knowledgeable speech on this hugely important issue. I will attempt to answer his questions. Perhaps the coat eels debate is probably for another day, but I look forward to it, not least learning what the impacts are, but I don't doubt that cocaine use, human cocaine use has had a marked impact on the river environment, but it's not an area that I know a great deal about, so I look forward to hearing more about it in a subsequent debate. The Honourable Member mentioned his constituent Maggie, who I believe is 12 years old, but he can tell Maggie that I agree with her, and I've agreed with her since I was her age. Indeed, I've committed most of my life to campaigning and working on these issues. Nature clearly matters, and given that it is the source, the only source of all our wealth, our health, and indeed our lives, you could say it matters more than anything else that preoccupies us in this ever madder place in which we all work. All the research, including the very recent State of Nature report, which has been mentioned by a number of honourable members, paint a very gloomy picture of nature loss in the UK, with 41% of our species declining since the 1970s. And the report does point to some success stories, and it would be wrong to overlook them. And many of those success stories happen as a consequence of government, conservation groups, farmers, land managers, all working together. But those success stories, nevertheless, are the exception, and we need much, much more. The situation globally is even worse. Scientists have warned us that even a 1.5 degree temperature rise will be absolutely devastating for humanity, for ecosystems, indeed to the natural world as a whole. We're not heading towards a 1.5 degree rise. Currently, without radical intervention, we're heading towards a 3 degree rise, which is almost apocalyptic, if we believe the majority of scientists. Earlier this year, we saw the results of the most comprehensive yet assessment of the state of nature around the world. And again, the news is really bad. It tells us that there are 1 million species today on the brink of extinction. In just a few years over my lifetime, so since the early 70s, I was born in 75, we've lost a staggering 60% of the world's land animals, and we continue to destroy an area of forest the size of 47 football pitches every single minute. Someone better at maths than I will tell you how many football fields worth of forest have been destroyed since this debate began. And it is utterly shocking. Our oceans, meanwhile, are under siege. By 2050, we're told they will contain more plastic than fish, if measured by weight. And fisheries that once seemed inexhaustible, such was their abundance, have either collapsed entirely or they are on the verge of collapse. The Prime Minister a few weeks ago referred to tackling climate change and biodiversity loss as two sides of the same coin. And that is right. We can't protect nature if we don't address climate change. We can't address climate change. We can't address it properly, at least, unless we also restore nature. And I would add that unless we do those things, we have no hope either of tackling base poverty around the world. And if that seems alarmist, we need only look at the facts. More than 1 billion people depend on forest for their livelihoods. More than 1 billion people depend on fish as their main source of protein. Around 200 million people depend on fishing for their livelihoods. And all of us, of course, ultimately depend on the free services that are provided by nature, without which we simply could not survive. So for the sake of nature and of climate and of people, it is critical that we step up our response at home and internationally. And the good news, as a number of honourable members have said, is that nature-based solutions have the potential to provide up to a third of the climate change mitigation that we need globally by 2030. And done properly, they can help turn the tide on the extinction crisis we're experiencing today and can provide sustainable, secure livelihoods for millions upon millions of people. And given that protecting and restoring nature provides a cascade of solutions to so many of the world's pressing problems, it is extraordinary that it receives globally such a tiny proportion of aid support. Of all the money in the world invested by governments in tackling climate change, just 2.5% goes on nature-based solutions. And nature-based solutions, clearly, as the Honourable Member for Brighton, I believe it was, who's no longer here, said should not become a substitute for decarbonisation on a massive scale. But those solutions clearly merit a far, far greater share of the resources. So I was thrilled when the Prime Minister made an announcement at last month's UN Climate Summit that we intend to double our climate spending here in the UK to £11.6 billion between 2021 and 2026. And, even more importantly, that much of that uplift would be invested in nature-based solutions and biodiversity protection. And we've already announced a £220 million fund to protect the world's biodiversity. That includes a new fund, £100 million, for a biodiverse landscape programme, a biodiverse landscape fund which will protect a large range of cross-border and ecologically biodiverse and important landscapes. We're also trebling annual funding for the brilliant and long-established, and some members will remember, threatened Darwin initiative. Threatened as in 10 years ago, a number of members had to step up to protect it because it faced closure. It's an extraordinary initiative, one that we can all be proud of. And we are committing an additional £30 million to tackling the grimly destructive illegal wildlife trade. We're on track to deliver the $5 billion of finance for stopping and reversing deforestation that we pledged alongside Germany and Norway in 2015, and we're putting big efforts into protecting the world's oceans. We've dedicated £23 million to supporting communities to maintain and enhance 20,000 hectares of mangroves in Madagascar, Indonesia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. We've directly helped 100,000 people through building resilient jobs and supporting marine life. We're on track to protect more than half of UK and UK overseas territories' waters by 2020, although through our world-leading Blue Belt programme. And we've announced that we intend to expand that Blue Belt programme much, much further still, with an initial £7 million put aside to protect some of the most diverse marine systems on Earth. At the UN General Assembly, we announced a global ocean alliance of countries committed to a new global target to protect 30% of the world's oceans, at least, by 2030. And countries are lining up to sign up to that commitment. I forget the exact number, but it's a relatively new campaign. And I can say that we have over 10 countries have signed up already, with a number of countries flirting with us. And hopefully they will sign up in the next few weeks and months. We're also working with our friends across the Commonwealth to tackle the scourge of plastic pollution in our oceans. 1 million birds, as one honourable member pointed out, and 100,000 mammals lose their lives every year from eating or getting tangled up in ocean plastic. As part of the Commonwealth Clean Ocean Alliance, we've invested in programmes worth up to £70 million to tackle this issue. And in addition to this, we've invested in research that we can better understand the role of the oceans in relation to climate change. The Honourable Member for Devonport and Plymouth South, or the other way around, I think, mentioned the value of seagrass. And he is right. Seagrass has an extraordinary capacity to absorb carbon, but we don't fully understand the role of the oceans as a whole in relation to climate change. For example, we don't know the full impact of bottom trawling and dredging on the ocean floor, but we're told, and the science is emerging, that suggests that it plays a gigantic role in terms of releasing emissions. And that is something we need to know. So we are investing in that research, and in the meantime, we are investing in protecting fragile ecosystems in the oceans. We're working on a number of other really big interventions on land and in sea, and I'm looking forward in subsequent debates to be able to tell honourable members who have an interest in these issues more about them. But it's not just about aid, of course. As we negotiate new free trade agreements, we need to be confident that we're not going to end up importing deforestation through environmentally damaging goods, a point that the member for Bristol East made. And the honourable member for Falkirk made the point about our own environmental footprint here in the UK. I believe it's the case that we rely in the UK on an overseas land area more than half the size of the UK, and that's just for imported commodities like palm oil and soya, and things that we feed our livestock. So we are, whether we like it or not, importing deforestation daily, despite the fact that most people in this country would be appalled to know it. And under our Global Resource Initiative Task Force, we are now working to create a plan to end our contribution to global deforestation through our supply chains. It is incredibly complex, but we're going to have to find a way to do that. I don't think we have any alternative. Finally, the OECD has estimated that the top 50 food-producing nations spend around £700 billion a year subsidising landowners and farmers, and at the moment they do so pretty badly with very little regard for sustainability. So we're going to have to find a way to encourage as many of those countries as possible to shift the way they subsidise farming, much as we're trying to do here through our environmental land management schemes. And we've set up an organisation, a campaign called Just Rural Tradition, which exists to do just that. 2020 will be an important year, a gigantic year for nature and climate, and we will be doing all we can to deliver meaningful commitments on the Convention of Biological Diversity in China and at the COP26, which we're going to be hosting with Italy in Glasgow. We want to focus the international attention on the importance of the opportunities inherent in tackling climate change and biodiversity loss through investing in nature-based solutions. I want to turn my attention briefly back home, which has been the focus of most honourable members' speeches, and where, as I said at the start of my speech, biodiversity is undoubtedly suffering, and we need to reverse that, and we are taking steps to do so. The UK was the first major economy to sign up to a net zero emissions target in law for 2050. And restoration of nature is going to be a very big part of our response to that challenge. We're already committed to planting 11 million trees in England, plus a further 1 million trees in and around our towns and cities. We are, despite scepticism from a number of honourable members, we are on target to do so. So I'm fully confident that we will meet that target. But equally, I'm not going to pretend that target is anywhere near ambitious enough, and we're going to have to do much, much more. The member for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport laid out the challenge, and I think he's right to. We need to ramp up our efforts. In the next few months, we will be consulting on a tree strategy for England. And earlier this year, we announced a new Northumberland forest to be delivered through a local partnership. This year, we will launch the Woodland Carbon Guarantee, a new £50 million market-based mechanism to provide long-term payments to land managers in England to plant trees. I want to move briefly to peat, which is an issue which is raised by almost all honourable members, including the honourable member for Romsey and Southampton North. Peat, including blanket bogs, as well as peat soils under agriculture, acts as the UK's largest terrestrial carbon store. When they're working, when they're healthy, they sequester carbon, they nurture wildlife, they act as a water regulator, and they contribute both to climate change adaptation and mitigation. But 86% of peatland emissions come from lowland peat in agricultural use. And this year we launched a lowland agricultural peat task force, which will deliver recommendations for new, more sustainable future for agriculture and lowland peat in England. A number of members, honourable members, have talked about the problem of burning peatlands, and there's no doubt that they are right, and the government shares that view. There has been an attempt through voluntary initiatives to scale back on that, in fact, to reduce and eventually eliminate burning of fragile and important peat ecosystems, but that hasn't proven to be 100% successful as had hoped. So we are now looking at, not just looking at, we are developing a legislative response to that problem, and we will come back to the House in due course with our plans. But there's no disagreement there, I would say, between the various speakers, honourable members who've spoken today about the need to address that issue, and we do have to do so through legislation. We're not, the alternative just simply hasn't worked. We are funding restoration of over 6,000 hectares of degraded peatland, much of that in the uplands, and we're allocating £10 million to 62 sites across England. And we're also publishing a peat strategy for England, setting out a vision to reverse the decline in England's peatlands and peat soils. Now, much of what I've described in my speech, both here and overseas, involves what some people refer to as rewilding, which is effectively integrating natural processes into land management. Rewilding, of course, is already happening right across the UK. There are lots of projects, many of them delivering huge benefits. And the Honourable Member for Bristol East mentioned Knepp Castle in West Sussex, where agri-environmental funding has helped create extensive grassland and scrub habitats with huge benefits for declining bird species like the nightingale and turtle dove. And I haven't been to Knepp Castle. I long to go to Knepp Castle, and I will be going. I'm told by those who have been that it is magical. And I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for quoting my brother's article in The Spectator, in which he promotes the value of untidiness in nature. He's also been a huge promoter of the release of beavers back into the countryside, so I would not get away in this speech without mentioning the return of the beavers more than 500 years after they were eradicated by us, let's not forget. And it seems to have been unambiguously good news. It's an extraordinary thing that's happening. Beavers are the ultimate keystone species. They build small dams along the river tributaries and streams, which play a big role in holding back water following rainfall and helping to mitigate both flooding and drought, while at the same time just breathing life in an extraordinary way back into the landscape. Science is only beginning to understand how it is possible that this simple species has had such a magnificent transformative impact on the natural world. So that is an area on which I'm in total agreement with my brother, and he would have been furious if I hadn't mentioned the beaver. In the marine environment, domestically, we are expanding our network of marine protected areas. The recent designation of 41 new marine conservation zones means we now have 355 sites covering 25% of UK waters. And our new Environment Bill, which has been mentioned already by a number of honourable members, includes measures that will address the biggest environmental priorities of our age and will ensure government is held to account if it fails to meet, for example, net zero by 2050. It will place a duty on government to set long-term, legally binding targets on biodiversity, air quality, water and resource and waste efficiency, and it will lay the foundation for the nature recovery networks, which will create or restore 500,000 hectares of wildlife-rich habitat in England, encompassing woodlands, peatlands, grasslands. I will give way. And coastal ecosystems.
Sir David, thank you. Yes, I can really commend my honourable friend to go to Knepp Castle and talk to the Burrell family that run it as a wonderful wildlife centre. I'm listening attentively to my honourable friend. I apologise I wasn't here at the beginning because I was in the chamber listening to the Prime Minister. But I just on this intervention, I did earlier on raise this whole issue of zero carbon medicines and zero carbon treatments and sustainable health care. And would he offer to have a word with the Health Secretary and share with him some of his experience in this field, please?
I thank him for his intervention. In terms of zero carbon medicine, I'm going to struggle to give him a comprehensive answer because it's not an area I know a great deal about. But there is a huge amount the NHS, as one of the biggest landowners in the country, could do. My opposite number mentioned the opposition's plans to require the NHS to plant 1 million trees on NHS land, and that would just be a start. As we build new buildings, as we expand the infrastructure for the NHS, we should be doing so in as close to a zero-carbon way as possible, but not just zero carbon, also a nature-friendly way. The food that is supplied to patients in hospitals should be local, sustainable, good quality food, as a number of hospital trusts already do. I believe the Royal Cornwall Hospital Trust is the organisation that wins the prize every year for the most sustainable, the most popular, the most healthy food, and they do so sourcing local ingredients. So there's lots the NHS can do, but I'm going to have to get back to him about zero-carbon medicines, because that is not an area I'm afraid I know a great deal about, but I will seek to find out more. So the Environment Bill also establishes spatial mapping and planning tools to help inform nature recovery, and sitting alongside the provisions set out in the Agriculture Bill, the actions and incentives as well that are needed to drive change on the ground. It establishes the Office of Environmental Protection with a statutory duty to hold government to account on its progress in improving the natural environment. And the cornerstone of our agricultural policy will be the Environmental Land Management Scheme that replaces the Common Agriculture Policy. It will be a hugely powerful vehicle for delivering real change. It could be the transformational policy in relation to our domestic biodiversity of anything that we've discussed here today, if we get it right. It means payment of subsidies to farmers and landowners will become conditional on delivering public goods like biodiversity, like clean water, flood prevention, mitigation, adaptation to climate change. It is potentially huge, and it's something that I hope the whole House will get together to support. Mr. Speaker, Sir David, this government is investing in restoring nature at scale, at home, overseas, and it is providing leadership. I have no doubt about that. But given the scale of the problem that many honourable members have outlined today, I'm not going to pretend that this or any government is doing enough to respond to the crisis. So I'm absolutely determined that for as long as I'm a minister, as long as I'm in this place, that we will do a great deal more. But in the meantime, I urge honourable members to support and work with us through the passage of the Environment Bill so that we can further protections for nature. And I congratulate once again the Honourable Member for Cambridge for raising what is perhaps the most important issue of all. I congratulate him on the speech that he delivered. Thank you.
Mr. Daniel Zeichner to wind up.
On behalf of the Petitions Committee, can I thank all the honourable members who have made contributions. I think it's been a very good debate. There's been a considerable amount of agreement. I won't single out many. I know that we're close to time, possibly in the other chamber, but I would just particularly mention my very good friend, the Honourable Member for Bristol East, for all the expertise that she's brought to this subject over many years. And I was particularly taken with her comments on the messiness of nature. I think it's an important point. But finally, Sir David, I would also echo very strongly the comments from my friend, the member for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport on tackling the climate and ecological emergency together. They are absolutely interlinked. And I was delighted to hear from the Minister what I think was a pretty strong pledge on ending peat burning. And I will be able to go back to my constituent Maggie, tell her that he agrees with her, and I'm sure she will hold him to all the promises that she sought reassurance on. Thank you, Sir David.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 254607 relating to restoring nature and climate change. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no, I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended.